Hey folks, here's your second video of the day. Today we're going to be talking about the anatomy of the clavicle, very quick, and also the anatomy of the humerus. So I wanted to start on this page of the PowerPoint, and this is a view from above. So we can see this bone here is the clavicle, and the clavicle essentially has two main parts that we're going to discuss. It has this end, which is medial, facing the sternum, that's called the sternal end. And this end over here, which is lateral, and that is known as the acromial end. It's called the acromial end because it is making a joint with the acromion process of the scapula. And so in a little bit we'll talk about these joints, but this joint right here between the acromion and the clavicle is known as the acromioclavicular joint. And this joint over here between the sternum and the clavicle is known as the sternoclavicular joint. So here's the rest of the PowerPoint, and I've just colored in both the acromial end and the sternal end. So go ahead and pause the video whenever you'd like so you can get caught up with this. In addition, we're going to be talking about just a few joints, and they're not listed on your page, so you need to be careful and watch your spelling and put these in the correct locations. But the one I just mentioned between the acromion and the clavicle is known as the acromioclavicular joint. We have the sternoclavicular joint between the clavicle and the sternum, specifically the manubrium of the sternum, and this guy right here is the first rib, right there. And then the third joint is between the glenoid fossa of the scapula and the head of the humerus. So we're going to combine glenoid fossa and humerus to come up with the glenohumeral joint. Glenohumeral. Now for the humerus, we're going to take a look at the proximal end first, and then we'll finish up with the distal end. So first thing you need to know is the head of the humerus. That's what's going to make a joint with the glenoid fossa, and that will be covered with articular cartilage, which is why we have a little bit of a different texture in this drawing here. Right next to the head of the humerus, almost where the articular cartilage stops, is a portion called the anatomical neck. And so I just drew a blue line there. The anatomical neck, many of your long bones will have both a head that fits into the joint and a neck. For the humerus, we have a little bit of a different situation. It's called the anatomical neck rather than just the neck, because down here where the diaphysis kind of begins, we have a section that became known as the surgical neck. So FYI, that's why this is known as the anatomical neck. That's the only time we're going to see that word anatomical in front of neck. In the vicinity of this, these two parts that I've just mentioned, we have two distinct bumps. And again, I know this is a flat diagram, so it's kind of hard for you to see without the model, but this bump right out here is a humongous muscle attachment site for your shoulder, the muscles that move your humerus in various directions, and that spot is called the greater tubercle. Tubercle is really just kind of a fancy way to say a bump, just like a lot of the other words that we have mean bump. And so this is a much, I wouldn't say it's much larger, but it's larger than the second part of the humerus, and this is always going to be on the anterior surface right here. That's known as the lesser tubercle. So greater tubercle is bigger, lesser tubercle is smaller. We've seen that word tubercle before on the rib. Between the two, and in a minute I'll show you some actual humerus pictures to try to illustrate this point a little better, is a pretty significant groove. Because it's between the two tubercles, we're going to use our prefix for between, which is inter, and call that the intertubercular groove. Now, there's a couple different names for it. Maybe if you've taken the care and preventions class with Tim, you've seen, what does he call it? Bicipital groove, because it has the biceps tendon in it. It's the same thing. Intertubercular groove. So greater tubercle, lesser tubercle, between the two, a groove known as the intertubercular groove. A little bit further down, about mid-shaft of the humerus, is a area that's really just kind of looks like a roughened patch, and that's known as the deltoid tuberosity. A tuberosity is described as a roughened raised projection for muscle attachment. Honestly, there's not a huge distinction between tuberosity and tubercle. So you may sometimes hear other people interchanging these words, but for us, these are tubercles, this is a tuberosity, and we'll see this again a lot. The muscle that's attaching there is the deltoid. And unless you have an actual real skeleton in front of you, it's pretty hard to find on our little budget models. They didn't do a great job with that. It's not a humongous, amazing part that sticks off and is super obvious, but we'll see that in class. Let's take a look at the posterior view, and we'll kind of copy our answers over to this side. So here's the head, and right next to it you can see how it does narrow a little bit, just a tiny bit. That's going to be called the anatomical neck again. And from the posterior view we can really get a better look on how much of a projection this greater tubercle is. So there's the greater tubercle, same colors as before. The lesser tubercle is unseen in this view because it's on the anterior surface. And then this also is a little bit better view of the deltoid tuberosity. You can see something special is going on there, and that's where the deltoid muscle is going to insert onto the bone. All right, distal end, it gets a little tricky, so go slow with this. Remember, we have two bones that are going to make a joint with the distal end of the humerus. We have the radius and the ulna. The radius is always positioned laterally in anatomical position, and for this arm that we're looking at, oops, let me go back. For this arm that we're looking at, the radius is going to be hanging right underneath here. Right next to it, taking up this spot right here, will be the ulna. So go ahead and write little tiny words, radius underneath this one little circle, and ulna underneath these two bumps. And when we progress onto the lower arm bones, that'll make a little bit more sense. This whole section down here on the distal end will make a lot more sense when we get to the radius and ulna, because we have a lot of similar parts that are fitting together and they have similar names. All right, so the first one that I want you to mark on your notes is the coronoid fossa. It is a shallow depression, and when your ulna makes a joint with the humerus and you bend your elbow, there's a tip of the ulna that's going to fit into this fossa. So if this wasn't there, you would not be able to bend your elbow as far as you can. So coronoid fossa right there. It's the more medial of the two. And then we have a much, much smaller radial fossa on the lateral aspect, so that when you bend, the head of the radius bone is going to fit right up into that little fossa. Okay, and those are indentations that are allowing those bony parts to fit together when you bend your elbow. Again, make more sense when we get to the lower arm bones. Right underneath the radial fossa is a portion of the humerus called the capitulum, and the head of the radius will directly form a joint with this portion called the capitulum. Okay, and I'll give you a way to remember that when we get to the lower arm. This thing right here, I feel, is one of the more notable features of the distal humerus, and that thing right there is also, like the capitulum, will be covered in articular cartilage, is known as the trochlea. And that means spool. So apparently anatomists thought this looked like a little spool. I guess if you turn a spool of thread sideways, maybe that's what the deal was. So there's the trochlea, and then two more parts on this anterior view and we're almost done. Just a note, both the capitulum and the trochlea are the condyles of the humerus. So technically, if we split this humerus into, let's say, halves, those are going to act as the condyles of the humerus. If you have your little half sheet, your cheat sheet of definitions, a condyle, like we saw in the mandible and on the occipital bone, a condyle is a knuckle-shaped bump that forms a joint, and I guess, you can see these look like little knuckles if you make a fist. It almost looks like a little fist. So these would be the knuckles that make the joint. That being said, there are bumps upon a condyle. If you look on your cheat sheet, you'll find that word, and that's known as an epicondyle. An epicondyle is not for joint formation. It is for something other than a bone to attach. So maybe it's a ligament, maybe it's a tendon, but something is attaching to the epicondyles, and so we have both a lateral epicondyle and a medial epicondyle. And you'll notice that medial epicondyle is significantly larger than the lateral, and actually it's something that you can feel very easily on the medial aspect of your elbow. It's not your elbow point directly on the posterior surface, it's on the medial aspect, and we call it the funny bone. So let's progressed to the distal, posterior end of the distal humor, the posterior side of the distal humerus. I can get this right. And there's our deltoid tuberosity from before. There's that huge medial epicondyle. So this is a right arm. We just flipped it over to the back. There's the lateral over there. So we'll go ahead and add those two in. You can see the medial one is just waiting for you to hit it on something. And we have a nerve that runs right in this groove behind called the ulnar nerve. And that's why you feel that like horrible funny feeling that goes down to your ring finger and pinky finger, because that's where the ulnar nerve goes. So you irritate the nerve when you hit your funny bone. We see again in this view the trochlea. It looks a lot more spool-like from the back, but what's essentially missing from this back view is that capitulum. And so if you have your hand in the anatomical position, the capitulum would be kind of on the other side of the bone. It would be about here on the lateral side, because radius is always lateral, capitulum meets the radius. Our final landmark is called, this is a great word, the olecranon fossa. And the olecranon is actually a part of the ulna that will fit into the olecranon fossa. So again, I know this is a lot for now, but it will make 100% more sense once we get into the radius and ulna. Okay, we're going to use a lot of these words again. So there's the olecranon fossa. That's a pretty good indicator. You're looking at the posterior view versus the anterior view, which you would see both the coronoid and radial fossas. All right, next up will be the review homework video.